referring to language or genre or topic, and so on, and we would like to model this, but at the same time, this space is not accessible completely, right? We always have essentially just, like, you can think of this as a sample from that space that we are currently working in. And that makes it challenging, right? Because then we have data scarcity, and we would like to understand everything in this space and how varieties connect to each other. But say even if you're just focusing on a sub-variety, then we still have always only access to a limited sample. All right, and so let's look like just a little bit more of what makes it so challenging to work with language. Here is an example of just a single word, right? Like nothing. And if you think about, oh, you said nothing, then I really like this example from Jack Reeve and Dong. They collected information about how this was spelled on social media, and now you see the rich variety of diverse spelling variations here, for example. And they take this as an illustration to express, there is more than the message, the word that we're expressing here. There's all this meaning, the social meaning behind the words we're expressing. But at the same time, NLP is essentially kind of, not yet able to capture. As we saw here in this workshop on various talks, we are not able to fully yet, process this, understand this, because there was traditionally this kind of focus on the standard language varieties. And so that's actually good news, because we have a lot to do, right? There's a lot to pass forward to work on, and very exciting work, because then it goes also multimodal, and all sorts of additional challenges that we can add as models get better. And indeed, language is full of variation, as we already have heard. People speak and write in multiple different ways. We can take different facets of this, right? Regional variations and so on. But essentially, is again on this topic, standard versus the rest. We treat it mostly as noise, and here is indeed, while social linguistic is really one source of information to look at. Hey, let's look at the social aspects, and they have a lot of thought about this for a long time. And so this is really, Anne-Marie, who's also sitting here, presented a paper at LREC in the main conference about, hey, let's treat this. This is really the norm is the variation and not the standards, right? So I think this is a really important message, and so putting forward, again, a connected variation space to think about this variation broadly, and connecting it also to the social linguistic dimension. What does it mean for NLP and social linguistic and vice versa? So I invite you to have a look at the paper or talk to Anne-Marie. She's here also. All right. Then let me see. And actually, I was really impressed yesterday, right? Let me actually just go to this. Yesterday, we saw a wonderful invited talk. And Dan ended on this very nice quote that I very much like. The common misconception is that language has to do with words and what they mean. It doesn't. It has primarily to do with the people and what they mean. So I really, really also like this quote, and I think this is also what motivates us to talk about socially aware NLP together with David and Dirk. Trying to go beyond even just the language form. We have, as a field, very long been very busy with trying to get the technology, the processing right, and that was very challenging. And now it's good time to, hey, we can actually look beyond what does it mean, the social implications, the user implications, and all this type of interesting questions, while still trying to get the basics right. And so here's a nice illustration to capture this, what goes wrong, essentially. This is by an illustration by Max, my former PhD student, and he kind of summarized nicely, you have language variation across all these diverse dimensions, and the problem is, as language variation kind of goes up, our performance kind of goes down. And so that's kind of the problem that we're trying to tackle. So the question is, how then can we make sure that everyone is kind of understood in the ultimately, right? That's kind of the motivation. And so you can think of this, now you know why I have these dots, right, to illustrate the variation. So we would like to have models that take this and are able to process some sort of target we are interested in. broadly speaking. And so one way to kind of bridge this is transfer learning or transfer methods that we have also seen here in this talk, in this workshop today. So we'll very briefly touch upon some of those. But before going there, let me just give you one more motivation. So, you know, how quite some have probably seen this plot, right? The long tail of languages. This is from XLMR. So back then we still knew what sort of data was in it. I mean, at least the languages that were in the model. And so this is just illustrating that you usually have a set of, you know, high resource languages, right? And then there is this very long tail towards what we often sometimes call low resource languages. But what I would like to highlight here is that we kind of think of this space in some sort of monolithic view, right? We think, okay, we have, say, German and Italian, so here we have two representative high resource languages, right? And then all the way down we have a lot of low resource languages, but, you know, we think of them as these monoliths, right? The German as one thing, and, you know, but we all know, and that's why we're here, that this is not the full picture. That's a valid assumption to start with, but it's very good to now move forward. And so let's look at this a little bit, because, you know, language variations everywhere, and just illustrate a couple of examples. And these are really just illustration, because after today I could add a lot of more to this picture. But let's look at indeed two languages I also speak. So in fact, Italian, for example. You know, this is a plot by Alan that shows already language varieties in Italy. It's a very nice paper. But even yesterday, I was supposed to, you know, if you just look at Lombard Wikipedia, then there's 9 different orthographic variations, even just within here. Or if you zoom in here into this small corner, you know, that Latin is this other language we heard before very briefly about, then there are also, as Samuel has shown, you know, it's working, there's 5 varieties of Latin even there that are then challenging to process. So there's a lot. So like Europe is really a very rich territory for working on these varieties. Or indeed German, right? If I roughly, approximate where it's written, where it's spoken, then we zoom in into Bavaria, where I'm currently located. And if you zoom in there, it's again, if you look at Bavarian, oh, actually, you know, it's a lot of variation. And this is just at the aggregate level, right? It spans not just Bavaria and Germany, but we have Austria, and we also have, again, this little thing that we saw before, South Tyrol in Italy. So a lot of variation in there. And so we also, in our lab, started to work on, you know, automatic speech recognition and try to capture, you know, also there, if just in Bavaria you have already Franconian, Bavarian, Alemannic variants. So a lot of variation in there, broadly speaking. So this is kind of an opportunity really to move away from this monoliths to embrace this continuum of variation in NLP. And I want to just highlight very briefly this one as well, because as I don't know, most of you probably know, I'm from this area originally. And so I think a lot of the talks we see is also, hey, we are speakers of our dialects. We're now actually able, or would like to contribute to our own language, right, and dialects. And so South Tyrol is indeed what we heard before, the northernmost province. It's in the Alps. Here's a picture from the area. If you go hiking over there, I can give you some recommendations. And we have these, you know, German, Italian, and Latin. We have even German, you know, standard at school, and dialect really spoken in everyday life, as we heard before. So it's really a language or dialectal variant. And the 5 Latin valleys, or the 2 of the valleys are in South Tyrol, essentially, and Italian spoken there. And I just want to quote Heidegger, because it's really like a nice kind of motivation also. You know, this relationship between a dialect as a mother tongue and a sense of home in a way, right? It's really about the connection that is particularly strong with dialects. If you can express yourself in your own mother tongue that has variants that maybe you don't exactly have in the standard or in a closer related language, and so on. And I think that's also kind of a little bit of a personal motivation to work on dialects. All right, so ultimately we would like to do, say, say we want to tackle Bavarian, on the other hand, then we could start with German, but now this transfer is really a dialectal transfer, right? It's going beyond the traditional transfer learning approach, because on the other hand, we have all these variants that we would like to capture, and there are big open questions on how can we actually do that best in the future. And so in the rest of the talk, I would, before I go in the rest of the talk, I would just like again to highlight, now is very good time to go beyond the standard and embrace this variation at the core, but at the heart of NLP. All right, with that, let me get into the rest of the talk, and I would like to first start a bit on, reflecting on what makes dialect challenging. I mean, you all know this, I just want to kind of recap and summarize this in a bit. But then I focus on German dialects, which is what we are working on in the lab mostly, especially indeed Verena will present a lot of work. Verena is sitting here on what we have been doing. And then talk a bit about some methods, but not focusing on this, and in the end, more focus on user needs. So what do dialect speakers want to before finishing up? All right, then let's have a look at challenges with dialect. And first of all, what do we mean by dialect? Here in this talk, we are focusing on non-standardized variants, right? So no standardized orthography. We often hear this, right, even before, is there a standard orthography or not? And typically, here also, they have a closely related standard or roof language for it. And often you can see this as the standard dialect continuum, where the standard is on the peak, so to say, and all the dialects are at the lower levels, and then you can see how whether here German dialects or Dutch dialects and so on. But let's look at what makes dialects challenging, and we can think of it as from these different viewpoints. And so let's start first with a couple of linguistic differences. And here again we can think of this as this nice cone where we have the standard and then all the variation down to the dialectal forms, and then let's have a look at some of examples with a Bavarian variant. So here's the example sentence we're using. Sie haben keine Beine in German, so they have no legs. And you see how it would be transcribed into one variant of Bavarian, right? And so what you see is there are differences in lexical choice, but there is also differences in syntax, right? There is this negated form at the end, the double negation essentially. And so there is, and moreover, as there is no standard, if you ask different dialect speakers, they write in different ways, like here, to have is written into different forms. And this is about what is the pronoun here? This is about fish that have no legs in this example. But here there is more. So here's, for example, if we zoom into this Latin variant, again, the two values, Valgabena and Barbaria. Here is the English sentence that was translated to Italian, and then to the two forms. And here again, you see differences, right? Like there is different word choices for roof here, and to see small, again, with not just lexical, but also smaller syntactic differences. Even within Latin, that's considered one thing, and so again, we have a lot of variation inside these language variants. Right. So like the dialects are really interesting because there are all these different levels that makes it challenging and different linguistic differences at different levels. But then if we move to data, right, it's kind of a bit tricky, right, as you all know. So it's like the opposites of this triangle. So we have a lot of data for standard languages and kind of very, very little to almost none in most of the dialects. So also a challenging, interesting question, how can we get data? How can we share data? How can we make it, accessible and so on? How representative is it? There's a lot of questions. I think I posed more questions here than answers in this talk. All right, so when we started out, indeed, when Verena started, one of the first, I think, papers or works was, hey, let's look at what's actually out there, right? What is, if we restrict ourselves to Germanic languages and dialects, what is out there, and we looked at examples of data sets, and we found over 100 of 35 Germanic dialects and made them available in a GitHub repository, so you can have a look. And this was a lot of work for Verena to really look over all these data sets and quantify what's out there. And what did we see? So we were interested in, okay, what kind of annotations are even available, if any at all? And so in here you see a map. This is probably not readable, but what you can see is that it's likely missing a lot of entries, right? And in fact, there is some columns are more filled, so to say, and for those we have more information available. So there's some morphosyntax data available, but a lot more on dialect classification data, for instance. And it gets rarer if you go to more specific tasks like translation or slot and intent detection. So different tasks, the more specific, the less data is available. But of course, this has also grown in the meanwhile. So this was now 3 years back. So that's nice to see that this is getting more populated. Right. There are also Wikipedias out there, and there's quite some for low resource languages. What is though, interesting is that they are rather small if you compare them to the standard, right? They also have very, the editors is huge on the standard varieties, but there's not so many contributors also. That's maybe also important to keep in mind. We are modeling a certain subset of who is contributing as well. But nevertheless, luckily we have this data available. But they also vary a lot internally on how, how they treat, how do you write and stuff like that. So it's good to look into these Wikipedia communities that differ within themselves also. And in fact, what we also observed is that there's really a different set of quality. A lot of the data is unannotated. Most of you probably have heard about quality issues with all these data sets. So there's this study by, for instance, Julia Kreutzner, finding low quality data in multilingual data sets, or the Scots Wikipedia issue, which was someone giving a parody on Scots, not being a native speaker and contributing a lot of data. Or here's an example of the West Flemish QD corpus, and if you look at it, you probably all see that it's not very West Flemish, right? So this is an issue that you can you run into if you look into some very low resource languages and dialects. And another thing is often it's very hard to understand what's actually the transcription, if at all, or like the metadata about these corpora. Also sometimes tricky to understand. All right, so we saw now linguistic and data challenges. Next, I would like to talk about representational challenges. And what is this about? Well, if you think about what do we fit into our models, then we need to think about, particularly for dialects and non-standard languages, that there is also a lot to do in the tokenization stage. So here, if we look at the sentence here, and look at how it would be segmented with in standard German, you see that this is kind of the subverb token that, which seems quite reasonable. But as soon as we go to, non-standard variants, we actually observe often an over-segmentation, and then they are, of course, not that well represented in the language model, because it splits them up typically more often, and it doesn't represent them very well. So this is also something, how can we get better in representing actually the actual input if we have written non-standardness. And finally, the last point is evaluation. That's really a big point, right? How do we evaluate if we have not much data available? And so here, of course, let's look at what has been done. If you are in a situation that you have some gold data, then that's great, right? Because then we can test, as we heard before, there's at least test data available. That's already something that we can work with. transcription, translations, or some sort of annotations of a task that you're interested in. And then we can measure like the performance gap also, right? How good does the system on the standard versus on the non-standard variety? Sometimes referred as to the dialect gap also. And just to give an example, we have contributed the Bavarian tree bank. It's called MyPalm. Again, thanks to Verena and Logan who led this effort. This is annotated data for the universal dependencies, and you see again that there is crossing dependencies. It's a challenging, interesting set. And with that, we could evaluate then passing systems, right? So we created an evaluation data set, not a training data, just an evaluation data set. And here is what you get if you test different passers on standard accuracy and labeled attachment score. They were quite high, right? As we would expect. And here is what would happen on our Bavarian test set. So you see how much there is in gap and towards the Bavarian form. But there's also interesting differences between systems here. And in fact, we saw that UD5, which has some form of character handling, was much better than another system. So again, thinking about what is the input representation of the system, how could that help you, might give you a better system down the line. And then, given that, you can also look at, okay, here's the goal tree, what are systematic divergences that we can find in this data that differ from the standard. And again, I invite you to talk to Verena for details if you want to know more about, in general, this data set as well. Right, so, evaluation obstacle. Here we had some evaluation data that was nice to evaluate the system, but often we don't have that. And what do we do? Well, one solution is creating resources, right? It takes time, but it's also very valuable because then you create artifacts that remain. There are some challenges to it nowadays. But indeed, we spent quite some time of the project, indeed, the first 2 years on creating resources. And just quickly giving you some idea of what we have created is the tree bank I mentioned, slotted intent detection data set translated to different, also students, contributing your own dialect, named entity data set. Then later we moved to creating evaluation data set for automatic speech recognition to standard or the orthographic form. And we also created lexicon information, so using lexicons from language models, again, different variation dictionaries, and a resource to do cross-lingual information retrieval from Wikipedias in dialectal form, and so on. So we have worked on some of these tools, particularly for Bavarian, to kind of build up slowly a set of suite to be able to test models that you might want to know how good they are doing. But the very interesting question is actually, what do you do if you don't have that? You don't have gold data. And this is indeed an interesting research question, because what else could we use to evaluate systems? And here I'm just giving some examples. There is, examples. So here is the work by Sims et al. From D. Young's lab. I don't know how many of you have heard about this. So the idea was to use linguistic resources like this atlas, E-Wave atlas, that gives you information about, how the syntax differs, or, linguistic information that you could then use to essentially try to test your system with. So you're injecting this information into your standard data to make it look like dialects on these dimensions. Now, it was very nice because they had access. This was done for, I think, English and some in Singlish, or not remember in Singlish or Hindi. So English variants. But we were interested, and they had this access to this atlas system. So if you have it, then maybe is there a way that you can use this for your own testing? Essentially, that's the key question. And we wanted to do something similar for German varieties, but we didn't have access to this resource. So what we did is actually collect from the literature a lot of phenomena that are known for Bavarian. For instance, the possessive construction, or that there is often articles before names, die, blah, 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 stuff like that, and then use this information to inject these perturbations into your data to kind of get a proxy evaluation, right? It's only a proxy, and see how would your system degrade if you go from the standard to the standard that you essentially perturbed for the evaluation. Okay? And then you can combine these different rules and so on. So this is one way that you could perhaps use and evaluate your systems. Now, bigger question even is, now if you look back at the previous example that I just showed you, here it was all classification or structured prediction task, and we know that what's the gold label, right? We know how to evaluate once we have, so we just perturb the input, so to say, because we relied on the standard label text essentially, right here, the slots, for example. But what do you do if you're actually interested in creating a dialect generation system, right? Like translation into a dialectal variant, or speech to text translation. How do you evaluate that? Because now we don't have just, one reference, or maybe we have one reference, but the reference, the way you write things might be, you have this high variation on the other side. And even if you have a reference, our standard ways of evaluating assume one, right? We're usually comparing to one reference and not the whole fledged variation. So here's a work by Noemi, and she was looking at this for Swiss German to have two ways here that how to spell the words, and you have the German translation, and it's similar to the example I've shown you before, right? It's just to have variation. Okay. And what they used is essentially contrast sets. So you have two pairs which are similar. You create a third pair that you corrupt by something that's not, hier bestraft is behandelt. You change the word meaning, so this should not be the correct. The meaning, the semantic meaning is shifting. And then you want to find a metric which is essentially telling you these two are closer than if you pair any of those with this one here. And if your metric is able to tease this one apart, then it's called a dialect robust metric. And that's one way to think about how could we evaluate, in light of this high variation. Right. Okay. Again, I mentioned ASR, or speech to text, and I mentioned the BETHOOP, so this data set we created before very quickly. What we did there is collecting German standard translations and one form of how to write it in Bavarian. So we had only one transcriber, so that's a limitation here. But what we saw is if we then compare human judgments to the with the automatic metrics, even relative to the standard, if we look at speech to standard translation, then these actually are not very high correlations in terms of Pearson. So effectively, what I would like to say is that our metrics are not capturing the nuances very well that we can find in transcriptions. And if you look then at in detail at error analysis, so we compared it, we asked humans to judge it, but we also looked at, asked them to judge, okay, would this be a plausible, acceptable transcription? And you then see that these white ones are actually what humans would judge as plausible, and they would not be captured by our metrics, like here the ear, like Ehrgeizstück, or here how you write Zeige, and so on. So there's a lot of things that our metrics are not capturing at the lexical level, yet to speak of, like perceptive constructions or idiomatic expressions. There's a lot to be done in this space. How can we capture this better in the future? Or predict even what is a good transcription without a reference? So there's interesting questions here. All right, so I hope you are with me still. And let's look at the second part. This is a bit, I keep it on the shorter side because I think we heard today a lot of, the how, and I would like to focus more on the why in the end to wrap up this talk. And if you think about, okay, what can we do about it? Well, there's transfer learning, right? There's tools that we can use nowadays, or we can use LLMs directly, but we just heard they're not so good. That's quite some tasks, which is also good to hear. So there's, thinking back at traditional approaches is very valuable in this space, to not jump immediately, let's use LLM for everything here. And so we can think of at least two kind of broad adaptation approaches in the data space, try to adapt our data so that we can hopefully better model the target, or do it in the model space essentially. And then in the data adaptation space, just two examples here. One is, if you think back to cross-lingual transfer, you can align, if you have parallel data, you can try to think of how can I use that information to some sort of project. Like in this example, we projected our speech tags through languages to get some sort of silver data, and also think about, okay, if we do that, we get automatically training data, but how can we select good quality annotations? And there is, to think of, okay, maybe the alignment between words is actually helping us. If words are more often aligned, they are more better translation, better data that we can project. And that's something that helps. So less data from this pool of automatic data is sometimes useful in this space. This is nowadays done less actually, right? Because you rely on multilingual parallel data, and that's not often available. So what else can you do? You can maybe have dictionaries available, and then you can also use those as kind of ways to observe data and inject information. So here's an example from Luxembourg that Anna-Marie was working on. She had access to spell checker data where humans provide variants, and you also have access how often humans would choose this variant over other variants, and use this information to create training data, for example, which is kind of user-driven, right, in a way, that you then can train, for instance, in this case, to train a normalizer. I think this is like, how can we use different sorts of information in creative ways, essentially, because we have no data, like just bit level. And so, this is kind of the data adaptation space, projection. Okay, translation, if you have a translation system, often not the case, or some sort of synthetic data augmentation. And then the other side is adaptation, and there is a lot of work in this, fine-tuning, or nowadays even modeling internally, steering, or prompting, and so on. I'm not really much going into here in this talk, but I want to focus on the representations, because model adaptation includes also what sort of representation we are using as input. And so, let's think about these input representations a little bit more. And, you can think of one way to go about this is trying to change the input to make it closer to the variation you're interested in. And I will show you some ways to do so. In fact, one way that was proposed by Noemi and Rico was to inject, in your standard, inject character noise, and in this way you're able to hopefully get also better subword segmentation that helps you transfer the gap, essentially. And this was working quite well when you inject 15%, in 15% of the words you inject actually random characters turned out to be the best. And they were showing that this is really, really helpful, because now you can think, okay, I have my model, I have maybe some target Y data unlabeled that I can use, but maybe I can actually, Y was Swiss data, but then actual Swiss data. But you can enrich this with this noise to make it even more, variant of there in a way, so to say. And they had some success in improving, using this technique. I have it here. German and Swiss German. So, you have German, Swiss German, or you make this synthetic Swiss German from German, right? Maybe we shouldn't call it this way, actually, to be honest. And so you can combine this, and this can help you bridge the gap, essentially. with some easy method. But we were wondering, how does this work for non-standard language varieties, like at a bigger scale? And we did this for speech tagging, then worked with Verena, who's here, and we were collecting different, Germanic, but also Norwegian, French, Spanish, Arabic, Finnish dialect variants. And what you see here is essentially the black ones are accuracies of pulse tagging on standard variants, and on you see different monolingual versus multilingual encoder-based models, and increasing corruption rates, so noise levels. And so you can see that, standard results are very high. You see again the gap to the yellow one, but we also see that, the best performance was often a bit higher, even injecting a little bit more noise was more useful than like the 15% that was done a priori. So sometimes more noise helps, and it's a question, okay, how do you choose the noise level, right? That's a challenge here. And here you see, for instance, different noise levels. It goes down if you inject more noise, but we found that the one kind of signal that you can look at is how often, what is the split word ratio of the target data, and that's somewhat correlated with accuracy, but it's not that you can use that to predict it, but it's at least an indicator of how often words are split as a signal to which noise ratio to use, essentially. All right, so this was with subword tokens, right? And another way is visual representations. And that's a very different paradigm. So instead of subwords, there is Elizabeth Zaleski in 21 has proposed it for machine translation, and then later Rust in 23 proposed it, the pixel model, which uses visual representations as input. And the idea is essentially that you render your text as an image. You don't have then, these subword tokens, but an image that you then process with some sort of, convolutional encoder, spatial encoding system. And this has been shown to be quite robust to kind of, some characters, typos, noise in the input data. So we were wondering, is this actually useful also for non-dialect representation? So does this work on non-standard languages? So they trained this pixel model. Essentially, you can think of this as pre-training by masking these batches from the image and pre-training this model. This was done in English. So we trained with Alberto, who visited us. We trained a German pixel model, essentially. And then tested it on different tasks, like post-passing and topic detection, and against standard versus dialect variants. As you see here, for instance, this would be the subword model, and this is kind of the pixel-based model. And now, just very quickly, what did we find? This German pixel model on the standard variants, it's very hard to see, right? This looks all very similar, but there are small differences to now, this was BERT in this case that we compared to on top of speech text. But we saw that it works really well on cross-dialectal settings, particularly for syntactic tasks. And less for topic classification, right? So we saw some differences, but for syntax and intent, we saw that the pixel model was quite robust, and so it works well in these setups as well. So it's an interesting. You see here again, we have now standard intent, we have different Bavarian variants, we have Swiss German, we have also South Tyrolean here to test this model on. So I think it's an interesting approach. It's still not always the best, right? It's again, when do you use such an approach and when is it useful is the question. All right, so let me see. How am I doing with time actually?
Please, 5 minutes.
Okay, perfect. And let me finish up with the last point. The question is now, okay, we did all this work and let's reflect a little bit. What do actually speakers want, right? And this is motivated by a lot, also by what Stephen Bird is working on and advocating on, right? Looking at our community. And this is work what we did with Verena, actually trying to survey or getting to ask speakers what they want. And so here we focus on a survey of attitudes for on language technology for German dialects, and we asked people, okay, suppose you would have this dialect technology, how useful would you judge it? And does it depend on whether the input or the output is dialectal, or whether it works with speech or text, for instance? And then what we try to do is to get respondents and reach out to community. And this is we got over 400 respondents, and you see here where they are located, where they declared to be from. We were quite happy actually that we reached so many, so that was really a nice outcome. Of course, there's some bias towards where we're located, but we try to reach a variety of speakers. Also from different age groups, so it is a convenient sample. It's not a representative example, but we are happy that we reached actually more than what we had expected that sample. And 327 filled out the questionnaire, completed it, and we asked essentially for, suppose you have an assistant like Google Home or Alexa, how useful or useless would it be? So the more red, the more useless, and the more blue, the more useful it is. And you can see here the different technologies. We gave them small descriptions of what these are, right? What does it mean? Machine translation system, an ISR system, and so on. And what we found is essentially, we also asked them for feedback. So some people gave us feedback, like here about assistant. The beauty of that, in general, this was one speaker, sorry. The beauty of dialect is that there is no spelling grammar rules and everyone can write in their own dialect, which is important since the exact version of one's dialect can be extremely local. So this is translation of one of the speakers. So, okay, this is why, what about the input exactly? And what we see, okay, you see here that like some technologies are clearly judged more useful than others, right? Like say, spell checkers were not deemed that useful. Machine translation was also valuable, but then it depends on the output essentially also. So if you look at dialect input versus dialect output, people were really happy if the input was dialectal. For instance, here with the assistant, but also for machine translation, it was more interesting for speakers to be understood than to be, that it writes back or translates into the dialect, for instance. I think, and that was actually a motivation for us because we worked a lot. We come from the text-based tradition to also start looking at the speech processing. And also here, dialect, but to German, also other variant in machine translation rather than to dialect output. And for speech, for speeching, again, if you look at the output, then people are more interested in, for certain technologies, to get speech understanding, speech input than written input, which also makes sense. Like, you would like to talk to your assistant at home and not have to write to them and stuff like that. So this indeed is a study that motivated us to look into, as I said, speech technology as well, but it was nice to also reflect a little bit on, okay, what do dialect speakers want, what are technologies that you could also prioritize developing in future, and so on. And we see happily that others have followed up also trying to do surveys for other communities, and so that's very nice. And so to wrap up, I'm essentially at the end. I would like to just sum up what you have seen. I think, I'm here in this room, I don't need to advocate it so much, but I think dialects really are not just, these edge cases that they used to be. It's really a good moment now to work on dialectal variation. Why? Because also from a research perspective, they force us to rethink certain things, right? If we think about variation or how to get data, how to do transfer, there's a lot of open questions and way of space for innovation. It's also interesting because it brings you to other modalities that you haven't worked on before, new challenges, new learning opportunities. And transfer learning, I only very briefly talked on this. Essentially, as of now, there is no free lunch, there is no best method for, tackling one problem. So a lot to be done. And finally, the last point I want to mention is we really need to move more towards variety-aware NLP, especially for low resource languages and dialects. As we heard, variation is the norm. I think it's really nice to embrace this more, and so to go really towards fully embracing dialects at the heart of NLP. Or more broadly speaking, let me end with one slide, like this full spectrum of variation, which is variation input that we saw, variation also in the output, or people perceiving things differently, and how can we model that. And with that, I would like to thank you. This was beyond the standard. And actually set up, I would try this. I wanted to try this. I tried to make this lecture, and if you're interested in this, let's connect. Let's build this community and getting together and share, information and so on. I hope this helps us to really bring variation-aware NLP more close to the heart of everyone and to the center of NLP. And so please join us here. Let's see how this works. And with that, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for the excellent talk. We can take questions while people take photos of the slide. We'll also share. Yeah, we can share the slides later. And, Barbara, we can share the slides with us, and we can put them in the.
Yeah. Okay. I can share the slides later on.
Yeah, we can put them on the website as well.